Good evening, everyone, and welcome to lecture series. I think we've got a really interesting talk ahead of us this evening, and I'm very, very grateful to Bournemouth University for providing us with two excellent speakers, experts on this subject. So if I could introduce Professor Candida Yates, who is going to wave perhaps, or...
Hello.
Yeah, and Amy Tatum, also from Bournemouth University.
Hello.
They're going to be our speakers this evening. I do recognise a number of the names up on the screen, and so you know sort of how we generally operate. But if I could just suggest that we allow the speakers to do their presentation, sort of uninterrupted, and then when they finished, we'll open up for questions, and perhaps if we could use the chat bar at that point, just so that the speakers can have a little look at the questions as they come up, that would be grand. So I believe I'm going to hand over to Amy first of all, and look forward to hearing what you're going to say on female political leadership.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to make a start then?
Yep. Okay. Thanks ever so much, everybody, for inviting us along to speak tonight, and thanks for coming. So tonight we're going to be talking about women in political leadership and looking at the different aspects of that. I'm a PhD student at Bournemouth University, so I'm in my final year of my PhD. My research looks at how women respond to women political leaders and looking at the responses to women political leaders more generally. So what I'll do this evening is I was going to start talking a little bit about some of the barriers that women face when seeking political leadership. Both Candida and I tend to look at things, we apply a psychosocial approach to understanding these areas of women in political leadership. It means we look at some of the social drivers behind these things, some of the psychological drivers behind these responses to women in political leadership. And at Bournemouth University, we do tend to, there is that aspect through our politics degrees as well, the more psychopolitical, the political psychology aspect of it as well. So we can talk a bit about that later on as well. So I'll share my screen with you. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the barriers that women face when seeking political leadership. But first of all, I think it's really important that we think about the situation with women in political leadership at present. So many people might think that actually, is there really an issue regarding the representation of women in politics at the moment? But when we start looking at the figures, it's quite clear to see that actually women still are really underrepresented in political leadership. That's in executive office and also in legislatures, so in parliaments and decision-making bodies. So currently, only around 9, coming up to almost 10% of political leaders, world leaders, are women. And on average, women make up just 24% of legislatures worldwide. That does include those countries, the data from the countries which have quotas as well. So given that women are 50% of the population, it's not difficult to see that actually there is still a real issue when it comes to representation of women in political leadership. And, you know, it's an important aspect. It's an important issue that does still need to be looked at. If we think about, you know, representation is important, and it's when women make up this half of the population, to not have their voices and their experiences heard in these decision-making positions is something that should still be being looked at. So I want us to think about some of the barriers that women face in terms of gaining political leadership, being voted in as leaders, but also when they are leaders, some of these issues that they face. And the first one is that of gender stereotypes. So when we think about stereotypes, what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are energy-saving devices. They allow us to process information about an individual. This is based on the observable traits that we can see in them. Given those observable traits, we tend to assign them to a certain social group, and thus we make decisions based on who they are, based on what social group we've assigned them to. So gender stereotypes are based on cultural, historical, and societal norms. So what we tend to, think of as a stereotype is what we tend to see around us. Gender stereotyping comes into this in terms of what we see around us of different genders, the way we believe they should be behaving, the roles they should be playing, the type of people they should be. And gender norms really brings in this idea of what we tend to think is appropriate and what we tend to think is, an acceptable thing for certain people who we assume they're the gender group they belong to. So we have to think about gender stereotyping in terms of women political leaders, is that actually we can activate these gender stereotypes quite easily. They can be activated through media coverage. If we have media coverage of women political leaders that tends to talk about certain aspects we think are something that actually we think, yes, that's appropriate for a woman, but also alternatively, they can also access our stereotypes of what we think might not be appropriate. They can be activated through campaigns. They can be activated by the candidates themselves. So stereotypes can be a really powerful thing when it comes to political leaders. And it's really important to remember that we are all prone to stereotyping. We are all genders are in certain, different cultures and societies, we're all socialized the same way. Therefore, we can all fall into the traps of gender stereotyping. This isn't just, one gender, certain genders against women. And what's really important to think about when we think about women political leaders is that by the very act of them trying to become members of parliament or trying to become executive office holders, they're transgressing these gender stereotypes. And the research shows that actually when women transgress gender stereotypes, they often can face a penalty for this. That penalty may be something, it might be bad media coverage, it might be a lack of people voting for them, it might be a lack of voter confidence. And so it's really important that these gender stereotypes, yes, they are things that we might not even be aware are happening, but actually women can pay a price when they transgress them. For women political leaders, gender stereotyping can be career ending, or it can make their time in office incredibly difficult. It can also hinder women getting into office in the first place. So stereotypes are something that they are a very big barrier for women seeking political leadership. The second barrier I want to talk about covers this idea of role congruity. So there is a theory called role congruity theory. And basically the theory states that there are two different types of attributes that a person can have. And there's agentic attributes and there's communal attributes. So agentic would be things such as what we might think of courage or aggression, or whereas communal traits are things like empathy, compassion, caring. And what we tend to think of is that men hold agentic traits and women hold communal traits. And that is what we tend to think stereotypically is the case. So when we start thinking about leadership and the type of traits that we want leaders to have, they tend to fall traditionally into the agentic pool of traits. Therefore, when we think about leadership, we tend to think that men are more congruent with leadership, and thus women are naturally incongruent with leadership. So this congruity theory works towards these stereotypes we're talking about, but really puts them into play when we start thinking about the role of leaders traditionally and what we tend to think how leaders should behave and the attributes that they should have. So what this means for women seeking political leadership is that they then enter into what's called the double bind. So if a woman wants to run for a position of leadership, she needs to be able to show that she has got the agentic traits that we would assume will be required for leadership. But the difficulty is that she also needs to be able to show that she has communal traits that we would typically expect her to have as a woman. So when women are running for political leadership or they're holding political leadership, this is a really, really difficult path for them to tread, to be able to show voters, to be able to show the citizens that they have the agentic traits for leadership, but that they also have the communal traits we would expect they would have as a woman. If not, in either one of these, if this balance isn't held particularly well, then it could be that, again, they face those same punishments I was talking about in terms of transgressing those stereotypes. So the situation gets more complicated, especially when talking about women political leaders, because they also face the double bind. Bear with me on this one. So what actually happens is that when we think of women, we stereotypically think that women will be able to show emotion, they will be able to empathize, they will be able to show those communal traits we were talking about. But if you have a leader who is considered emotional or overly emotional in situations, they tend to be thought of as not a particularly strong leader. But for women, if they showed this unemotional leader type trait that we would expect, someone who was completely in control of all emotions, that might make them a successful leader. But as a woman, if they aren't showing emotion in a level that we would think would be appropriate for a woman to show, that empathy and that caring nature, then she's not going to be deemed as a successful woman. So again, you can see it's a really interesting and difficult barrier for women to overcome. We saw this time and time again in terms of Theresa May. You know, she was always told how we were always told how she wasn't emotional enough. She wasn't showing a caring ability enough. And so therefore people didn't really understand her type of leadership. But then at the end of her premiership, when she did show some emotion, suddenly everyone was quite uncomfortable with this, and that our prime minister was showing these levels of emotion. So we can see it played out time and time again, and it's a very interesting path that women leaders have to navigate. And I also wanted to talk more about the cultural barriers. So Sarah Bennett Weiser, she talks about the idea of popular feminism and popular misogyny. So popular feminism, if we think about feminism, it's really become a buzzword over, the last few years. We see so many celebrities who are declaring themselves feminists. We have politicians declaring themselves feminists. We have lots of different merchandise. It's talking about, the power of women, the future is female, this kind of thing. But the problem with popular feminism is that it doesn't call for those same, it hasn't had the same call for solidarity or for institutional change that we saw in some of the other waves of feminism. So when we start thinking about popular feminism as a movement to help women political leaders, it doesn't have the same impetus to get women into political leadership. It doesn't have the same ability to support women. We saw this a lot during the 2016 campaign with Hillary Clinton. There was a lot of rhetoric around, her being a woman and her standing up for different women's rights, and she talked a lot about playing the woman card in a positive way. But actually what we found as we got closer to that election is that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. So popular feminism becomes a real hindrance for women political leaders in that way, because it doesn't actually call for a movement towards greater equality for women. And one of the issues with popular feminism is that it also triggers popular misogyny. So popular misogyny comes as a response to that popular feminism. It's networked. It's a response to the threat to the patriarchy that is seen by a perception of increased equality for women. So misogyny, when we think about this, is in terms of trying to keep women down. Kate Mann calls it a policing arm of patriarchy. It can be, we've seen it more in online hostility. A lot of the online spaces, social media, have become really dangerous places for women. Women political leaders especially receive an awful lot of hatred and aggression and misogynistic attacks on social media. But it also is within campaigns. If we think about some of the male political leaders that we've seen in the last few years, Donald Trump and his misogyny was very clear and very open for all to see. So popular misogyny, it's also really important to remember, can be used by all genders against women. So women can be misogynistic as well. Again, as I was saying earlier, we are all socialized in the same way. We are all subject to these same ideas. So popular feminism, popular misogyny, this increase in rhetoric, this lack of any call for institutional change in terms of the feminism, but also this real aggression towards women and women political leaders has become a massive barrier for women political leaders. And so we could ask, why does it matter? Why does it matter if we have these barriers? Why does it matter if women are being kept out of political leadership? Well, it matters because representation matters. It matters because women's voices need to be heard. Anne Phillips, in her book, The Politics of Presence, she talks about how it's very difficult for one group of people to represent another group of people when they haven't experienced those lives lived. And that actually, when you have a group in Parliament, or you have a group in these legislatures who haven't necessarily experienced these things that other people have experienced, they can't always make the right decisions in terms of policy, or even understand what it is that needs to be on the table in terms of policy. It's also really important because when women see women political leaders, when they see women in these positions, they become more politically engaged. All the research shows that, especially for young women, seeing women in positions of political leadership increases their engagement in politics, increases the way they feel about the role that they have to play in society, and they become more politically engaged. And it also matters because of equality. Women need to be valued, they need to be equal members of society. Atkinson says that actually when we don't have women in positions of political leadership, it sends a cue to women citizens that they are more subjects than citizens. They are there to be ruled as opposed to be involved in ruling. And so it matters because actually there needs to be that basic equality. So I hope that just gives you a bit of an idea of some of the barriers that are present. My research looks at these barriers, but it also looks at how these barriers are playing out in people's lives and how they feel about them. So I'm happy to later on when we do question and answers, we can talk a bit more about this, but I shall pass over to Professor Yates now so that she can pick up from where I left off.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you. Okay, right, I'm going to share my screen with a different, okay. I'm going to focus a bit on in my presentation, I'm interested in picking up some of the points that Amy's made and focusing a bit more on the emotions and our emotional investment in some of the feelings, in the thoughts and prejudices we might have and attitudes. So I'm going to be looking at that. And I'm also interested in the idea of perceptions of female leaders at times of crisis, like the one we're in at the moment. There's been quite a bit, hasn't there, in the press about Jacinda Ardern being, coming up as a very good leader at this time and so on. So, yeah, I mean, Amy and I have held events around this theme, and we've been doing some research as well, aside from her PhD, with groups and listening to people's attitudes around this theme. So I'll be drawing on some of that. Okay. As we've said, at Bournemouth, the politics degree, the BA and the master's program, and we're now attracting PhD students, looks at political psychology, but not in a kind of traditional hard scientific way. We draw on something called psychosocial studies, which is my background, my disciplinary background, developed actually at the University of East London. And I apply that kind of framework to political culture. And the idea of the culture of everyday life and politics as being part of that, and people's feelings about politics and so on. So I look at the psychological and the social, not just side by side, but the ways in which our identities are shaped both by society and the social context and ideology, but also by our biographies, our feelings, our own psyche. So there's this sort of mix. Well, the social is psychological and the psyche is social. It's that view. Okay. So So one of the kind of important context really for the research that we do is this idea of the emotionalization of politics, a bit of a jargon sounding word. I mean, you could just say the emotional context of politics, but it's a term that's used quite a bit. And this idea of the emotionalization of culture, of politics, sometimes referred to as the emotional turn in whatever discipline you're focusing on. In politics, it tends to focus on the language, the style of politics and the way it has become increasingly emotional. Often they sort of take it back to that moment of Princess Diana's death, when everybody was so emotional at her funeral, and people went, blimey, I didn't know the British with their stiff British upper lip could be so emotional. And Tony Blair stood up and was tearful and so on. And that's in the UK. But generally, politics is often seen now to have become more emotional, and female politicians are often framed through a lens of this emotionalized political culture. There's sort of, it's gendered. So when we're looking at the emotionalization of politics, it is a gendered phenomenon. And also, you know, we need to hold in mind the kind of intersectional dimension of identity. So it's gendered, it's raced, and so on. Today, representations of politicians, I'm just going to move this because your face is and their engagement with the public attract new levels of emotional identification and feeling. And there's quite a bit of research into this, particularly through social media and the kind of posts that people do, very emotional responses it attracts. In the emotionalization of politics, you get the kind of, the language is very emotive, the content and style, policies going back to the 90s, focusing on ideas of resilience, of emotional resilience and so on, is used, and it's drawn on in political communication and driven by social media. Now, our emotional engagement with politics is also linked to psychological unconscious mechanisms of fantasy, identification, and defensive psychological mechanisms of projection and splitting. And I'll go into that in a second. Now, at times of political crisis or insecurity, there's often a wish for a strong, containing leader, a leader, you know, reassures, a symbol of stability. And in my research, if you sort of talk about this topic, people often point to male leaders such as Nelson Mandela or Barack Obama as symbolizing a good model, or a kind of good enough of a strong male leader who's also kind and containing, perhaps holding those two traits that Amy was talking about, communal and agentic, and they're allowed to be both, actually. And there's often this sort of projection onto the leader. In the political psychology literature, they talk a lot about the kind of symbolism of the leader as a parent and the good father. But what about female leaders and the leader as a good mother, if you like? I mean, we may all be thinking here of Mutti, you know, the Angela Merkel. Well, how might we go about exploring this identification, these feelings that are stirred up in relation to the leader, maybe as a symbolic mother? In object relations theory, it's a branch of psychoanalysis, it's a branch of theory. It focuses very much on the kind of images and fantasies and the kind of behavior and based on observations of babies and so on. And they trace back a lot of these kind of primary feelings we have about politicians as parents back to the kind of experience of the all-powerful mother of infancy. And early experience of the powerful maternal figure, they say, creates both a kind of longing to merge and have this strong maternal figure on the one hand, but also there's a fear of merging with her, of feeling engulfed, of feeling swamped by the feminine. So we see this kind of dynamic in myth, in stories, in film, played out in popular culture. Anybody here who studies film or advertising or TV will see this kind of dynamic sometimes played out. But we also see it, that kind of language and imagery in the press, in media coverage of female leaders. Now, at times of crisis, feelings of anxiety are managed via psychological defenses, such as projection, when you project aspects of unwanted feeling onto another, so they have to carry it and not you. And this is first experienced, psychologists tell us, in early childhood, when you feel powerless and you defend yourself against feeling powerless. And these are stirred up as adults in situations where there is crisis and perhaps you feel powerless. And when dealing with authority figures. And these kind of early experiences establish a psychosocial pattern for how one relates to others and female authority figures later in life. So these psychological defense mechanisms, which are kind of developed early in life when we don't have, we are vulnerable, our projection and projecting unwanted feelings onto the other, splitting when you deal with anxiety, not by holding that anxiety and managing complexity, but rather by splitting into good, bad, good, evil. You remember that rhetoric about the evil empire, or she's fantastic and she's, awful, or he's good and she's bad. So that's called splitting. And at moments of political crises, these defenses may be used at an individual level, but we also see it socially and politically played out at that kind of level of political rhetoric to ward off feelings of uncertainty and fear. Here are some images here of women as objects of love and hate. Now, poor Diane Abbott, as you may know, has attracted more hate mail than any other leader ever. This is to do with racism, it's to do with sexism, and maybe her policies stir up hate. But look, here we have, when she gave this speech about refugees and people coming to the UK who are powerless, she got a particularly vitriolic response. But people also love Diane Abbott, and her constituents vote her in time and time again, and she's a very good local MP in that regard, and many people hold her in very high regard. Another person who attracts a lot of love or hate, of course, is Margaret Thatcher. There she is, in her tank when she was driving around with the Union Jack, I think probably following, as Boadicea image there, I think following the Falklands. But again, as you'll remember from her funeral, many of those old feelings were stirred up again. Some love her, some really hate her. We could go on. There are many of these figures here. This kind of ambivalent, this mixed maternal fantasy, as I'm calling it, is often kind of sexualized as well with these female leaders. Often the Home Secretary, actually, it's quite a nice study to do. If you go back to Jackie Smith, I remember she gave this speech about a kind of attempted terrorist attack, and nobody listened to her words. They just talked about her low-cut blouse. This is when Theresa May was Home Secretary, though, her kind of fetish size shoes, and they would kind of look at her appearance. And here's an image of her and her dire response to Grenfell. But again, it was about her lacking emotion, and Amy's talked about that. The all-powerful mother, we see it here. Well, we've got Mutti with the famous womb signal there with her hands, which has been much commented on, and she's called the mother of the nation. She's, very much admired, but she got a lot of stick when she welcomed a lot of refugees to her country. And people were very critical on the far right and on more mainstream politicians too. They felt that she'd gone soft. Again, that communal and agentic qualities were seen as incompatible at that moment. There's Gucci Grace from Zimbabwe, who was criticised. I mean, that she was for all her shopping. And there we have, of course, Hillary Clinton, who also attracts, adoration and love, but also hatred. Amy and I, who teach politics at Bournemouth, notice that in students we often get quite a powerful reaction when we discuss Hillary Clinton. And Amy's study in her PhD is looking at that in terms of the interview responses she gets. So, we might think, well, in terms of crises then, how might we view female leadership? Well, perhaps, I've been looking so far at the idea of leaders, female leaders, as these kind of ambivalent, these mother figures who attract ambivalent identifications, ambivalent feelings, projections, negative projections, and so on. And these emotional feelings underpin the kind of stereotypes that Amy was discussing earlier. And but one wonders at the moment, perhaps at the current moment of crisis, which is a different kind of crisis, to do with the body, to do with care and so on. We've seen some female leaders attract some very positive coverage in the press. And in the interviews that we've done around female leadership, people are very complimentary about female leadership and saying that a different kind of response to the crisis is needed, and that the old, the big gung-ho macho charisma of somebody like Trump and so on is not effective. And the kind of contradictions of that, the kind of pleasures of that kind of charisma are contradicted by the realities of one's, potential, of one's mortality and death and so on. And often it's said that we live in an age of narcissism, sort of narcissistic culture. But of late, people have talked more about an era of melancholy, of mourning, of grief, and it requires a different kind of leadership. And some leaders now are reflecting that. And you could say, well, is a new model of female leadership emerging? And actually, when we say female leadership, do we mean, I suppose by this I mean, can leaders be tolerated? Can female leaders be tolerated? And I think they can now, who's caring and strong, who's agentic and communal. I've called it a more integrated, excuse me, I just have a relational approach. And I've got Jacinda Ardern there, and of course Kamala Harris. And Tenzing Wen up there from Taiwan. And of course, we saw Biden elected, who is clearly not a female leader, but he does embody a more empathic approach, and so on. So I'm just wondering whether we're now moving into an era where we're looking for something more complex, actually, and that perhaps this means it's not just that we want to have some empathic, sympathetic leader, but we want somebody that embodies all those qualities. And some of these women have been able to do that, and they've been able to symbolize that in a positive way. So we could talk perhaps more about that now, and we'd be very interested to hear, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Here we go. We'd be very interested to hear your views and about this question, and whether you've noticed different attitudes about female leadership, what that stirs up in yourself and perhaps your friends and neighbours and family, but also if you've noticed a different kind of leadership emerging and at a time of crisis and so on. So yeah, that's me done. So maybe over back to Andrew for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Candida and Amy. So yes, the chat line is open. So if you'd like to put in any questions, that would be much appreciated. We were chatting a little bit while people are putting in their questions. We were chatting before we started, Candida, about some recent events. And I was thinking of, how when Dominic Cummings was sort of, say, in power, in position, there was no hiding the fact that he was really quite a bully within sort of the civil service, and he kind of got away with it. When Priti Patel was accused of the same thing, it was considered something really quite monstrous, and we're seeing some things a little bit similar, aren't we? Yeah. In the discussions regarding the royal family and a certain person who allegedly was bullying members of the palace. Something quite unsavory, isn't there, if it's deemed to be the female who is very assertive, let's say.
Yes, and there's, and of course there's stuff going on in Scotland at the moment, whatever the wrongs or rights of what's happened. Nonetheless, there is something unsettling about that too in that context. And sure, there seems to be that double standard. And it does stir up really powerful feelings. I remember with Thatcher going back that, I still look back and think, in those times, was it something to do with her gender, which attracted so much, or was she so much worse than some of the other right-wing men at that time, like Keith Joseph, or I don't know, there were other very right-wing characters. But there's something about the female leader which often threatens and grates and annoys, and so on. But at the same time, I feel hopeful at the moment that this is shifting and changing. And I know that Amy's research, which is interviewing lots of people about their views, is also reflecting and picking up on that change a bit, I think.
Okay, a point I'll put to both of you from, I think it's from Judith, who says, most of us in this lecture are women, and I'm sure we have noticed the barriers faced by women. Maybe that we fail to notice when men get a similarly hard time. Bojo, I believe that's the Prime Minister, certainly is attracting both love and hatred at the moment. Either of you like to comment on that?
Amy, do you want to say anything about Bojo?
Yeah, well, I just generally about Drew's point, absolutely. I think that being a political leader is obviously always, you're going to have people who love you, people who hate you, people who actually don't know who you are. But I think the difference in those barriers are that the women have the same barriers as the men. They also have that extra, and like how Candida was saying that, with in terms of agentic and communal traits, and I was talking about that, it's absolutely fine for men to display communal traits that we might think are, not necessarily what we would stereotypically think that they should be or can be portraying, because we naturally already assume they've got agentic traits for leadership. So, men are absolutely, when they're leaders, they get criticism. It's just that they don't get it because of their gender. So, there's an added aspect to it that women will get, or there's added barriers that maybe men don't have when running for political leadership.
Yes, we've seen it, haven't we, with a number of, if male leaders, they tear up and cry, it's seen as something showing they're authentic and have a rounded personality. If a woman starts to cry, it's thinking, whoa, with Boris Johnson, it's interesting, isn't it? Because his partner, Carrie, is seen as Lady Macbeth at the moment. She's another one in the news at the moment who's stirring it up, was responsible for finally kicking out, what's his name? And Dominic Cummings and his clique that are meant to be a bit boysy. But again, it's, she's got this power behind the throne and so on. I mean, Boris Johnson, yes, he attracts, he's become, quite Marmite, hasn't he? He was, people love him, people hate him. And he's struggled throughout this because he was part of a kind of pre-model of the charismatic, fun guy. I bet he never thought that he would be ruling at a time like this. And he's had to kind of change. And part of that, I'm sure, is genuine because he was sick and he was ill and so on. And also the image makers have probably had to kind of talk with him and see how he can respond empathically at this time. But he certainly attracts a lot of love and hate. But he's if you look at the language, the body language, actually what he says, these three men, usually three men, not always, at that kind of those briefings, it is quite a it's quite a blokey setup, I think.
Candida, you did mention about the number of women that voted for Donald Trump. A question from Emily. What do you think attracts women to vote for male leaders instead of females?
Whoa. Well, Donald Trump, isn't it interesting? I was talking to my uncle, who actually has just fallen in love at 80, in his 80s, so that's by the by, but his new wife's sister, she says, oh yes, we like Donald Trump because he's he's seen as an old school man. That's a kind of generational thing, partly. They see him as this big, strong, capable man. Again, the strong father. He may be rude, he may be, sexist, but he's something authentic and real for some women. And they know where they are with him. They kind of recognize him. He's like somebody they know in their family. But he's reassuring. The other thing about Trump, I think, which is, part of his appeal, is that while he's very good at shaming certain groups, ridiculing them, mimicking them on stage, at the same time, I think he removes the shame for others, those who are, the so-called left behinds. And I know it's not just those that voted for him, but there are many people who have struggled to find a job, struggled financially, and he shows them love. And he says, it's all right, I love you. No matter who you are, you may be sexist, you may not be this, or you may not be that. I'm like that too, and I love you. And there is something, there's something appealing about him on that level, I think. Quite interested in Donald Trump and shame, actually, and the kind of contradictions around that. I don't know what you think, Amy, the appeal for Trump for these women who, some of them really love him, don't they?
Yeah, I think it's like, like I was saying earlier, we have to remember that, we are all subject to stereotyping. We are all subject to, feeling and thinking certain ways about men in leadership, and if that's all you're ever really seeing, then then the change can be quite scary. Or you can also have the same stereotypical views of what a woman might be like in leadership. So I think that women aren't immune from gender stereotyping each other. And a lot of in my research, I've been talking extensively to women. And when we talk about their own responses, often there is this element of, I don't even know why I feel that way, but I just know I do. It's that you can't necessarily explain how you feel about people in leadership. You feel that way, and it's built up of a lot of different aspects of your own life and things that you've seen. So I think sometimes we expect women to always be standing up for each other or voting for each other, and often there's many different types of women, and one woman can't necessarily appeal to all women. So, you know, I think there's many reasons as to why, but I think it is important to remember that women can be sexist, women can be misogynistic as well.
This is a tough question for you. How do we promote a more balanced representation of our population in power when power is so limited to the same cohort?
Yeah.
I think it's a really, really interesting question. And again, many women I speak to are really dead against quotas. You know, any type of quota for how many women should be in parliament, or how many people from different ethnic minorities should be in there. They want it to be something that is happening organically and because it's the right thing to do. But I don't necessarily. But I think there was one study done in 2005 that said if there were nothing was implemented whatsoever in the House of Parliament, it would take another 100 years for us to reach parity between men and women, and that's not even bringing in any people who are non-binary into the equation. So you think that's another 100 years to wait. Feels like a long time. I think it's important that we keep talking about this issue. I think often the perception is that gender inequality isn't necessarily an issue anymore, and I think, you know, when we start digging down into the statistics, we don't even have to dig, but when you start looking at statistics, you can see that it is still an issue. So I think it's a matter of talking about it and, you know, voting for people who might not necessarily look like what we, you know, are used to seeing as well.
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I kind of think about when I was promoted to the position of professor. I wouldn't have liked it if I thought, you know, I'm there because, you know, some quota or what have you. I do understand that. And yet, on the other hand, if the advert had been worded, you know, we encourage female applicants or something, you know, that might have brought, I don't know, but I think strategically, in the short term, that may be a way to bring in more women with more quotas, or, you know, to have an all-women shortlist in the short term. I don't think it's a long-term answer, but there seems to be such a kind of disparity that something needs to be done. Also, just sort of normalizing it and normalizing the idea of women in authority. So it's not just something that's unusual and strange that attracts all these projections. I mean, at the moment, a lot of women don't even want to go into these positions because they get so attacked and put down and so on. And because it's kind of somewhere, perhaps it's still unusual to see a woman up there talking. And a kind of special category, but we need to kind of normalize it, encourage it. And I mean, schools are a really good place to start, actually, aren't they? I mean, there's so many good role models in schools already, but encouraging young women to do this kind of thing is and to take a more active role, I think, is important.
You did mention at one point about this new model, this new sort of empathic model of political leadership. So we have a question here. Do you think this new model of political leadership is specific to times of crisis, or will it translate to a new method of politics beyond the pandemic?
That's really interesting, isn't it? I don't know for sure. One can't have a formula, but it may be, God, out of this awful time, maybe something. I think people are saying this about all sorts of things, aren't they? About climate change and the emergency around that. Maybe it's showing us a different way of being at this time, this particular kind of crises. I mean, not all crises are the same. You know, there's war, which is different again. But this kind of crisis is showing by example that a different kind of leadership is possible. And also people want it because their lives are at stake. They don't want somebody posturing and so on anymore, however enjoyable it may be to see, or entertaining, you know, politics as entertainment. Perhaps at the end of the day, people want to have something someone a bit more grounded and who's caring and sensible and so on. So we'll see, actually, with elections and so on. But I'm hopeful that this period, we won't go back to business as normal afterwards, not in this or in some other political areas too. I don't know what you think, Amy. Do you?
Yeah, I think that I think what we've been seeing is some really interesting, good results for women leaders, and I think that actually there's been a really good prominence. There is a tendency that women get given positions of leadership in times of peril and times of crisis. They call it the glass cliff, and actually that tends to be when things are in a time of crisis is when we tend to look to women leaders to sort things out. That might be that they're given a chance to do it that they're not normally given, because by that point it's like, well, we've got nothing to lose. So it will be very interesting to see if actually, what happens to these women leaders, because also, like Candy was saying, with this idealization, people like Jacinda Ardern, I mean, she is up on a pedestal at the moment.
Yeah,
that is a very difficult position to be in. And I think it will be very interesting to see. She'll be being watched even more closely, and are now on an international stage to see what happens. Nicola Sturgeon was riding really high in terms of the way that she'd handled the pandemic. And now look at what's going on, this week with her in front of the committees and people calling for her to resign. So we have to be very careful with women leaders, that sometimes they get to a point where they do become this idealized figure, and the only way is down. So I think that will be it'd be really interesting. But I think there's definitely a call for this change in leadership. A lot of my research is saying that definitely there is it is time to move away from this more hyper masculine strongman type image, and actually toward a more nuanced, more empathetic type of leadership.
I mean, I've just seen in one of the comments about why is sexism a thing and when did it come in? And, it's a big, really, gosh, we should have to come back and discuss it. It's a really interesting question. But I'm thinking, it is relatively recent that, the kind of gains of the second wave or women's liberation movement actually brought in these things. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that, if you broke up in a marriage, it would be woman would not be allowed by law to take the kids. I mean, it changes, and this is about entitlement and letting go of one's entitlements and so on. So alongside changing attitudes and so on that we've been focusing on, there's also about men and certain groups relinquishing power a bit and opening up a space for others. I mean, this includes white women too, in terms of questions of intersectionality, that we might have to forego some of our privileges to allow space for women of colour. So, it's a kind of dynamic process as well, of allowing more space. And that comes through education, consciousness, I could say consciousness raising, but actually, yes, being more aware, and education really, and some kind fellow feeling. But
we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to press on. Amira is going to put you on the spot with this one. So no political answers here, no politician's answer. I need a straight answer from you both. Who is your most inspirational female political leader? Amy.
Mine, I think, would be Ayanna Pressley. Ayanna Pressley is a member of the House of Representatives in the United States. She's one of the women who makes up what's known as the Squad, along with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom some of you might be more familiar with. She's an amazing woman. She is. She represents her district amazingly, but what I love about her is that she's really authentically herself. She displays all types of emotions, what we might consider to be, the more negative and the more positive. She's incredibly eloquent, and she is just fearless in the way that she stands up for women, and especially in the way she stands up for women of color. I think she blows me away every time she talks.
Thank you for answering the question so clearly. Candida, to you.
Well, I can't answer in that clear way. There are a few people that come to mind. I'm going back actually. Shirley Williams, I remember. Contentious, but when she, stood up and actually, left the Labour, it was a really hard decision. But I remember that period. I was quite young, but Shirley Williams, I've always had a lot of time for. And when I hear her speak, I think she's a very, measured and enjoyable speaker. Today, yes. Alessandra Cortez, absolutely. I think she's exciting, and she's just she's got that beautiful contained anger, and so eloquent, and some of the speeches she makes are extraordinary, and they're not phony, they're real, but they're very, very beautifully given. So I think she is somebody that I admire a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. Well done. Question from Amelia. Test your general knowledge on Scandinavia now. So the Scandinavian countries have been hailed in the media recently for their female leaders, particularly Finland with Sanna Marin, the woman leading the coalition. Do you think there is a difference in thinking about female leadership between the UK and the Scandinavian countries?
I think that the Scandinavian countries tend to be much more, liberal in their way of thinking anyway, in terms of taxation, in terms of care for their citizens. But I went to a talk by a Norwegian member of parliament, a woman, and she stood up and she was talking to all these other women members of parliament from across the world, and some of us who were just there listening. And she remember her saying, "Don't worry, we're further ahead than you, but you will get there. You just have to keep going in terms of representation." She said, "But we're just we're 20-30 years ahead. It will come for you." And I always take hope from what she said, but I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's a much more open, tolerant, accepting culture. But that's just my opinion on it. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I've nothing much to add other than I heard on the radio, I don't know if you heard it, but the writer of the show, Borgen, saying that the current Nicola Sturgeon thing going on was like, had all the ingredients of a Borgen episode, and he felt this kinship to Scotland because of kind of, as countries anyway, but talked about that and said something similar actually. But yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's a different sort of cultural norms out there, and hopefully we'll follow that in time.
Okay, thank you. A question from Abby. Do you think that political figures would be more scrutinised, both in Parliament and the media, if they were women?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe scrutinized in a different way as well. I think that media coverage for women politicians often includes more, as we've probably all seen, more about their physical appearance, more about their personal lives, more about how they look, who their partners may be, whether they have children. It's a different type of scrutiny. They're scrutinized much more in terms of their outside political life, as well as what's going on, in their political life. So yes, I would say they are treated differently.
They are, and it has an effect as well. I mean, there's a lot about performance. I mean, we know, don't we, with Margaret Thatcher, who had to, they taught her to lower her voice, to sound less shrill, and so on. And these are skills that women have to learn. This also has a psychological effect on the women themselves. And there's quite a few theories about what they call the masquerade, where women almost kind of perform as in a certain way, as a way to ward off kind of retribution and anger from their audience, from patriarchy, or from their fathers, if you like, symbolic. It might be their mothers, but they're trying to kind of ward off disapproval all the time, and thinking about their performance in those terms, in a way that men also have to do, but not in those personal terms quite so much. Clearly class plays a role for men too, and women, but there's something, it's very gendered, I think, that kind of scrutiny.
Thank you. Question from Christine. Would you say that the challenges that women have to face are the same as other members that belong to what we consider minorities, like ethnic groups or LGBT people? Is it all about being considered as too emotional or weak? Or is it due to being different from the classic leading figure of a white heterosexual male?
Yes, I mean, Amy, do you want to say anything about that?
You can go. You go.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think what we have to hold in mind also is that while gender is this distinct category and this distinct experience, at the same time, you know, this we talk about intersectionality, where our identities and our kind of access to power and the way that we are perceived is not just about, you know, just gender, that gender is also bound up with one's ethnicity, one's culture, one's class, the colour of your skin. All these different things come to play a role, and one's sexuality. And in different contexts, some of those aspects of our identity come to the fore and some not, but they kind of intersect and shape who we are and shape the perceptions of who we are. And so a woman of colour, I mean, I mentioned Diane Abbott, who's in the, you know, front line of politics. I mean, the attacks that she has received are beyond imaginable, actually. She's put herself out there as just an MP and as a kind of prominent leader. But clearly the kinds of attacks she had are about her being a woman, and they're sexualized often, but also they carry the tone of a kind of legacy of colonialism, of racism, and so on. So yes, these aspects of identity kind of work together, and they're part of a kind of hierarchy of power in public life.
Thank you. Question from Susie. You talked about the issues with popular feminism. Do you think this feminism would benefit from becoming more separated from pop culture, or keep evolving from this point as a cultural thing as well as a social and political one?
Yeah, I think feminism as a movement at the moment is having a real a real problem with its image. You know, we have huge amounts of infighting within the feminist movement, a lot of different camps and a lot of different arguments, and not really much solidarity going on. So I think although, yeah, popular feminism, what I'm talking about in terms of, you know, people like, you know, Beyonce, and we've got people like this who are talking about their feminism, but actually we're not necessarily seeing any of this drive to bring about this institutional change. So yes, I think that feminism is an ever evolving movement and has many different factions. But I think it's also really important, again, when we're talking about, you know, intersectionality, is that actually feminism needs to be intersectional as well, and feminism needs to appreciate and understand that women have many diverse identities and different influences in their lives, and I think until the feminist movement isn't so much run by or predominantly overpowered by white cis women, we're not necessarily going to be making great strides forward in terms of representing all different types of women.
Interesting comment, more of a comment than a question. This is from Judith, saying, in terms of the mother image in leadership that was mentioned, she recommends a book called The Choice by Claire Wade. It's a dystopian novel set in a future in which the challenge to the obesity crisis has gone overboard, and the slogan "Mother knows best" is used to justify all sorts of tyranny. Thanks for that, Judith.
Thinking of Margaret Atwood as well, that kind of dystopian novel, you know, and The Handmaid's Tale, and yeah, these some scary women in charge. Yeah.
And
written that down.
Yeah. In Rwanda, they have introduced quotas for a certain percentage of women to Parliament. Apparently, that's been very successful. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think there's been a number of, you know, real success stories in terms of quotas. Mexico is the same, you know, and I think it's sad that we have to introduce them, but I think that as a kickstart to actually showing greater and more diverse representation, I'm a fan of them. So yeah.
Okay. And Manon wants to know, why have women been excluded from the political process historically?
Huge question.
It's a huge question, but yes, I mean, there are, you know, to look at that question, I mean, that would be a wonderful PhD, wouldn't it? Or, you know, but, you know, you would look at the social, historical, cultural, political reasons. I think it's for the mix of what we've been discussing. Some people want to, you know, have held on to power and entitlement, this sort of old boys club patriarchy, call it what you will, have sort of that's sort of one aspect of it. Some the law has, you know, needed to change, and they struggled, and women died for the vote, didn't they, in the UK? Also, women themselves were holding back. Some, you know, didn't want to have, they wanted the status quo to remain the same, and so on. But it's a kind of mixture of things, really. And hopefully we can keep that momentum going and the change going and so on. And I'm very hopeful for the young generation. I mean, the young students we get are fantastic, aren't they, Amy? And they're really things that we used to kind of try and get, well, I used to try and get my head around. They're just taking for granted now. Like, oh, yes, you know, there's a confidence there in many ways, and an expectation that things have to be better. You know.
Question from Finley: what do you see as the most effective way of creating positive change in terms of equality and representation?
I think it's about talking about the issues. It's about looking at our institutions and seeing what they look like. Do they represent ourselves, yourselves? Do they represent your communities? If not, then I think it's about starting the work, and it's about getting involved. And if you look at what Stacey Abrams has done in Georgia in the US, she helped turn that state into from 2 Republican senators to 2 Democratic senators, and the state carried for Biden. You know, if you get in and you're doing the work and you're talking to people about these issues and making people aware of them, then, you know, real change can happen and real change can be enacted. But you have to be talking about it and engaging in it, because like I was saying earlier, you know, a lot of the things that we think about, we do so without really being aware of where it comes from. You know, if I say to you Member of Parliament, automatically in your head the picture is more than likely going to be of a white man, you know, and we don't necessarily always realize that we have these ideas in our head. So I think one of the most effective ways is to be talking about it, is to be challenging our own ideas, and then organizing to start making that change.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I think on the ground and from the ground up, it's really important, isn't it? And the community work and working with people at kind of the kind of local political level, and the community politics and organizations and so on. And a kind of understanding at that level can filter up, and people begin to challenge. I think that's absolutely right, Amy.
And the last sort of question or comment in the chat line is something that I think you sort of included in one of your previous answers, that the bottom line is those that stand to lose the most from change are the least likely to accept or adopt change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, there's a lot invested in you know, creating change. There's a lot invested in the way things are, you know, partly because one, you know, benefits from it. Men have benefited, you know, in power have benefited from it. But some women have gone along, you know, there's kind of projections, mutual projection. You do that and I do this, and let's keep it the way it is. Because if you change, then I have to change. And oh, blimey, things are difficult. We know this at a kind of personal level, but at a kind of social level, that's true too. But I think, I mean, they talk about this in terms of the much publicized masculinity of crisis, that, you know, every kind of 10 years we have a new masculinity in crisis. But what that means is that the old stories and fictions and myths about power and entitlement are being challenged. And yeah, so I I agree with what's been said there, but I think we have to keep pushing. And I think what we've also learned from the masculinity in crisis debates is that many men want change, that actually they don't want it to be the same as it was, they'd be like their dads or what have you. They want to be different. They want a different sort of masculinity. Perhaps they don't want to be the ones out there holding them, but they want, to share, because it's sort of nice to do that. So I think, again, I see that with my students, that the young men that I teach are really give me a lot of hope. And there's some wonderful young people who I think are challenging those ideas and will kind of open up a space for women to come up and share that kind of those powerful positions.
Question from Leah. We've just got a few more quick, just to finish off. Do you think that if the study of politics was compulsory within schools, that it would encourage more females to pursue positions of power?
Ooh.
Yeah, I think that you can't know what positions are out there and what paths you can take unless you're told about them. And I think this is where seeing role models, seeing women in positions of political leadership is so important, because the research plays out that the more young women see other women in these positions, and also it's under the responsibility of those women in power as well to be reaching back and bringing other women up with them as well, because there has often been this idea that actually when women get into these upper echelons of political power, they're like, oh, I've snuck in, but I better not bring too many with me, otherwise people will realize that I got past the gates. So I think, yeah, absolutely, I think it's really important, and I think that it's important to understand there are different routes to political activism as well, that actually women can be involved in very different aspects of political leadership as well. It doesn't just have to be as a member of parliament.
Yeah.
At Litchfield, we offer A-level government and politics, and one of the students in that class is Francesca Longdon, and she's asked this question: is degree level politics just as male dominated as parliamentary politics? Because in her politics class, there are 4 females and 14 males.
I think it's getting better. I did my politics degree 17 years ago, and now the students I teach, it's getting much better. But I think all the more reason why, if you are interested in it and you are a woman, then do get into that politics class, because actually it's really important that if you are interested in it at this A-level topic, then it'd be great if you could take that further. You're the type of people that we definitely need to be coming into the university and bringing all your experiences and your thoughts in as well.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I teach mainly on masters, and it's about half and half, and different ages and so on at that. But I think that's absolutely right. I think also it's about the kind of politics we're always talking about. What should we have on our degrees? We have these discussions with colleagues, as I'm sure you do in the school. What is politics? What's social justice? Is that politics? What should we call it? What's this? What are the boundaries and limits? And I talk to community workers who say, politics begins in the home. That's where politics is and reflects out there. So there's different kinds of politics, aren't there? And political cultures. It's not just about how many people in Parliament and so on. There's also the politics of care, which we're hearing more and more about. There's different kinds of politics where the boundaries between the private sphere, traditionally associated with women, and the public of men are becoming much more kind of blurred and intersect. And that has to be reflected, I think, in the content of politics degrees, so that it's relevant to more people and more interesting, actually. That's what I think anyway. And I'm hoping that more young women will come through and join us at Bournemouth, because we have some pretty interesting discussions, and we talk like this, about all sorts of things. It's not dry and crusty or just about or prime ministers and stuff, although that's interesting too. But I think there's a lot of scope today to define what politics is, and some really important issues that are being kind of led by young people to do with, there's stuff around Parliament and stuff, but there's also the climate emergency, there's stuff about care, about what that means, and equality and so on, and the family. So, yeah.
Thanks ever so much. I have to say, both of you have been fantastic ambassadors for Bournemouth University. A great advert for the university. Thank you ever so much. Really enjoyed the Q&A at the end, particularly. Fantastic the way you've responded to some very challenging questions. But thank you ever so much for giving up your time this evening to share your understanding and knowledge on this very interesting topic. Thank you to those, or to all of you who've sort of listened in and watched in. I can say that the next talk that we've got is on the 31st of March, Wednesday, 31st of March. It's on the topic of the United Nations and the context for the Sustainable Development Goals. So I hope you'll be able to tune in on the 31st of March. But thank you very much again, Candida and Amy. Really enjoyable evening. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.